Okay, so I am just about ready to release my next long format discussion for my website Athens Corner, uh, and it seems like everyone likes the long format discussions that I do. I did a poll and it seemed to confirm it, it makes me happy because the more I get to talk in the recordings, the more I get to go very deeply into these primary texts. So so that's good. And, and keep in mind when I'm doing the spaces here, it's usually just me thinking out loud, kind of collecting my thoughts for the very focused recordings that I do um, on my website and things. So, Heraclitus is here. Heraclitus, first of all, everyone should be following Heraclitus and Holistic. Holistic's great. Um, I see we got Zag and Robin here. Um, Good people all around. Ooh, Spurgler's here. This is great. Everyone follows Spurgler too. Let's see. Heraclitus. Well, looks like Heraclitus might have left. I was gonna. Oh, there he is. I'm gonna offer you co-host. So you don't have to take it, but if you want to, it'd be great. Either way. All right. So I've been in the middle of a move, and it has been beastly. I've not tried to move my library in at least 7 years. So it's, that's why I've been a little bit away from Twitter and everything. But I have been continuing to work on the materials for not just the spaces, but especially for the long format recordings that I do for the website and Spotify. Now, this one that I'm about to release is on Aristotle and Heidegger, and it's particularly concerning this thing that we refer to as technology. And so that's why, sort of on a whim, I decided to do this space because, and I'll get into it. Um, this crisis of science, the so called crisis of science, has everything to do with this thing that we refer to as technology. Certainly in the thought of Martin Heidegger, certainly in the thought of Ernst Jünger, um, and since Spurgler's in here, certainly in the thought of Spengler. So I'm excited to just read a little bit from some of these people about what they have to say about this crisis of the sciences. What most people can't even fathom the idea that there's a crisis of the sciences because the sciences, and in general, math in particular, that seems to always be the standard, the model for which we gauge the truth of anything. Uh, in other words, the clarity or the precision of knowledge that we might have about anything is always compared to the kind of knowledge that is alleged to be given to us through modern science and, in particular, modern mathematical physics. And as we're going to see here in this discussion, logic. So let me just give a little rundown here. And I see that I forgot to include. Oh, Dan is in here. It's great to see you again, my friend. Um, I forgot to include in that picture something that's very important, and not so much just important, but incredibly fascinating, uh, is really the origin of modern psychology as we understand it. Uh, Let me see. I might try to add it, but it's a book by Franz Brentano, and it's called. Let me see. Let me see. It's something like the empirical foundations of psychology, or something like that. This is the birth of modern psychology as we understand it. Let me see where I put it in my library here. I've got it around here somewhere. I think it's in the section with Husserl. Yeah. Okay. So there's an English translation of it, and it really is worth your time owning it. I'm going to do an entire space just on Brentano, but it's called Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. Now, what's so fascinating about this and why this book is so important as a kind of watershed for postmodernity is that Brentano, so we're talking about the late 19th century, we're just right there on the edge of the 20th century. Brentano was this amazing teacher of psychology, but also understood philosophy so well. I mean, this psychology hadn't been well marked out. Psychology was still understood as in the realm of philosophy. And in his course, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, you had two people, uh, one of whom was Edmund Husserl, the other was Sigmund Freud. And so between Husserl and Freud, you you get the boundaries, the contrast of what the 20th century was going to turn out to be effectively. Freud is going to go in the direction of a more empirical approach to psychology. If you can believe it, of course, he's very speculative with his theories about dreams and such. But in his studies on hysteria, Freud himself flatly says, I just can't get away from the fact that I think that the ultimate answer to all of this is going to be biological, and in particular, chemical. So he's going from the empirical standpoint. Now, Husserl, who was also in the course, he's going to found effectively what becomes in the 20th century the school of philosophy known as phenomenology. And I'll explain that a little bit here in just a second. But what's important is that with Husserl, psychology and philosophy are going to retain their unity. With Freud, they are not, and so everything we think of today as psychiatry that comes tumbling out of psychology. That's because of the Freud branch of the school from Franz Brentano. The so-called humanistic approach to psychology and psychiatry, really. Um, if you can believe it, there's a whole school of they have their own journals and everything. The humanistics, humanistic psychology, or something. There's also even one that I'm particularly familiar with, which is it's got a funny name. They usually call it EPO, existential phenomenological psychology. Uh, and so this is going to be heavily indebted to the thought, particularly of Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre. Uh, in other words, a more human approach than just thinking that we are hairy bags of water that can use that just simply require medication. Uh, it's a probably a losing battle, but one can always hope that we can get away from big pharma. But what happens in the sciences, it begins to take place with Kant. But most people understand the crisis in terms of, for instance, the famous problem of mathematical foundations. We see this, for instance, it appears to have been solved or something to that effect with Gödel's proof, right? The fact that you can have a system, but it cannot be. You can only have you can have one of two of the following to make the system. It can either be complete, in which you will find paradoxes, or it can be incomplete, in which you will find no paradoxes. So you're sort of on the horns of this dilemma. Euclidean geometry is exemplary of a complete system that has paradoxes, namely the parallel postulate. Uh, so that's going to, and that has huge ramifications, primarily for computer science, if you can believe it. Uh, von Neumann has an amazing essay about this. I probably should add it to my Telegram. Um, but most people think of it in terms of the mathematical crisis, right? But this goes back at least to Kant. And the reason it goes back to Kant is because it's fundamentally, initially, a question of logic. What can logic do? Uh, that's how this bubbles up. And it's going to be in Kant's logic courses where he talks about this. And Husserl and Heidegger, who I'm about to read here in just a second, they're going to mention this. But the way that you can think of it, most people are not familiar with Kant's transcendental logic. So let me use Hegel as an example, because most people are familiar with Hegel, unfortunately. But Hegel, it's well known that Hegel has this new, in German, it's a Begriff. We call it the concept or the Hegelian dialectic, very different from Socratic dialectic. And what it means, or at least the way that Marx takes it, and this is not the way it is in Hegel, by the way, I have to be emphatic about this. The way that Marx states it is that there's thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. So it's these three moments within any event in which contradictions or paradoxes are solved by way of a synthesis. Now, that's the Marxian understanding of it. For Hegel, it's not that at all. For Hegel, it is, uh, in fact, when I when I was going into my take my comprehensive exams for my PhD, one of the professors said, "Listen, if anybody ever writes down that the Hegelian dialectic is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, I will fail you entirely on all of your, like, you will not pass your comps at all. It's not just an error. It is so gross of an error that we won't even pass you on your comps." For Hegel, what it was is you have being, uh, like for its, well, it's being in itself. In other words, consciousness. And then it encounters that which is not itself. And so it recognizes being for itself, right? So this is the contradiction. So in itself and then for itself. And, and so then uh, it sees that paradox or that contradiction, and it manages mysteriously. This is what's so funny about it. It's what makes Hegel just really a mystic, is that it manages somehow, we don't know, uh, to synthesize, or sublate is usually what the English translation of the word is, to sublate itself into being in itself and for itself. So you have the best of both worlds. One can think of this in terms of the principle of non-contradiction. Uh, we have A is cannot be equal to not A, as a basic premise of logic. But what Hegel comes along and says is, no, you can have A, in fact, with not A. And in fact, it's something even grander than what each individually were. The German verb there is aufheben. Uh, it has that. It has these three different meanings, and so Hegel's playing with the German there to use those three different meanings as a philosophical concept. He introduced it's new under the sun. Uh, the resultant, by the way, in German is the noun Aufhebung. So you have the Aufheben, which is the noun, the verb version of what's happening, and then you have the noun version of Aufhebung, of what you get ultimately. Now, I would just simply say that if you want to laugh at it, feel free to, because I myself think that the Hegelian dialectic is one of the most amazing jokes that was ever pawned off as serious thought. That's why he was dismissed initially, by the way. No one really took Hegel very seriously. It was only it was only later that there was a resurgence in Hegelian thought for different reasons than Hegel. But he's a mystic. He's fundamentally a mystic. People will say it's hyper rational. It's not. It's only hyper rational or hyper logical in the sense that logic itself or reason itself for Hegel is fundamentally a mystical kind of thing. So, in other words, he's redefining logic. So, Kant does something similar. He expands the abilities of what logic was understood to do with transcendental logic. Hegel does something similar, but it's these things are not logically they're not similar. It's different redefinitions of what logic is, um, and that's why you're going to get from Kant all the way into the early 20th century, ending with Husserl and Heidegger, really, uh, the various masterpieces of these various philosophers of German idealism, and the titles are things like logic. That's what Hegel's masterpiece is titled, The Logic. Uh, you have a number of all of the German idealists are going to write treatises on logic, because they're realizing that logic is not, or they're trying to argue that logic is not what it has long traditionally been understood as from the so-called organon of Aristotle. Those are the loose collection of logical works, posterior analytics, prior analytics, uh, one could maybe even include the categories or something there, but that's what's going on there. They're saying that uh, there was more to it than what Aristotle initially provided, and so they're going to have their own approaches to this. And so again, whenever you hear people say things like, "Well, that's not logical," you have to pause and say, "Well, wait a minute. This whole thing about logic has been thrown into chaos for a while, for a couple of centuries." And so, what effectively becomes the crisis of the sciences begins with that, the tinkering around of logic. And it arises rather separately in mathematics, but still sort of related uh, by way of a number of very famous mathematicians, and Gauss in particular, because he's going to discover that you cannot prove Euclid's parallel postulate. And in fact, what's possible is that there are other geometries that are possible, because for over a millennia, Euclidean geometry was understood as the standard of truth simply. John Locke, for instance, famously says that he can solve the problem of ethics such that it is as perfectly clear and rigorous as Euclid. Now, he never does that, of course, because he can't. But he says he can. He just never does it. It's kind of funny. Um, but that's how powerful the claim that logic was for its bid to truth, to being truth simply. And so, if the standard of truth was utterly collapsed and exploded, well, what takes its place? Well, that's what's going on with these arguments about logic from the various philosophers throughout German idealism and into Husserl. Um, it turns out that they can't do it. This is the so-called crisis of foundations. So it's not simply a crisis of foundations in science. It's a crisis in reason itself. This is where, and it's on that we could say that postmodernity or postmodern philosophy and thought is officially erected, which is to say, human reason itself cannot significantly answer the most basic of all philosophical questions, which is to say, what is the good life and how do I live it? The claim is going to be that reason cannot answer that. And that's when you end up with Nietzsche. That's why he's so that's why he's so incredibly critical of Socrates, because he's locating the origin of this hyper rationality with Socrates or Plato. It's kind of hard to tell. He goes back and forth. Sometimes he says Socrates, sometimes he says Plato, sometimes he says both. Uh, but that's going to be the turn towards what we could think of as a kind of poetic thinking. Maybe even a better way to phrase it is that with postmodern thought, you get a turn away from what we think of as rationality towards this thing that we could refer to as either poetic thinking, or even a better way to phrase it, a kind of neo-Gnosticism, like a new rebirth or a renaissance of Gnosticism. That's certainly the case in Heidegger. And because Heidegger was so incredibly influential, it's been the case of all postmodern philosophy, particularly with the French, with their understanding of Heidegger in the form of various deconstructions and things like that. The text, in other words, has no meaning. And in fact, Lacan is famously going to say the text emanates within the reader. Doesn't matter what the author wrote, it just emanates within the reader. But that's sort of the broad framework here. Now, again, I want to emphasize that this has everything to do with my discussion of Aristotle and Heidegger for the release that I'm about to do on technology and nihilism through their thought. Because, so let's keep an itemized list here. I don't want to presume that you all know as much about this history as I do. So let me be clear. Brentano is the one who writes Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. In his course is Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl ends up being the teacher of Martin Heidegger. And from Martin Heidegger, so very much of this comes tumbling out. So that's what you get. That's the sort of the intellectual genealogy of why I'm talking about these things. Most people are not familiar with Husserl. It's unfortunate because, interestingly enough, and this is something I'm about to do an entire series on. You cannot understand the thought of Leo Strauss if you don't know Edmund Husserl. That's how crucial Husserl is. And Heidegger himself says, in Being and Time, his masterpiece, Heidegger himself says, the only prerequisite I assume of my readers is that they have read Husserl's logical investigations. So that's how crucial it is. That's how crucial Husserl is. But we just don't read him anymore. I mean, you can go through an entire PhD in philosophy and never end up taking a course that has anything to do with Edmund Husserl. I know because I did it. It's just unbelievable. Uh, but there's only so much that you can study or what have you. But it was a required text on the reading list for my comprehensive exams. However, so that's when I sort of became intoxicated with him, and also the relationship between Leo Strauss. But and you see that up there in the top. That's what all those top books up there that I'm about to reference here. Those are Husserl's. Initially, it's the Logical Investigations, which is roughly 1913. Then it's going to be, I mean, he publishes a few books, but his last book is The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. It's incomplete. That's roughly 1935. So this is 4 or 5 years after Heidegger, his own student, has published Being and Time. Now, what you don't see in those titles, either for the Logical Investigations or The Crisis of European Sciences, the subtitle for all of them that Husserl gave was An Introduction to Phenomenology. So all of his masterpieces were various introductions to phenomenology. So what is this thing that we think of as phenomenology? Well, that's a different space, but suffice it to say, it's going to effectively be what I'm about to read from him. But we need to keep this in mind. So I've mentioned that it originates with logic. This crisis begins with logic. What you have in the founding of liberalism, of modern liberal democracies, beginning with Hobbes and going all the way through, certainly with Locke and all of them, is they do away with metaphysics altogether. No one believes in metaphysics anymore. In fact, what Heidegger explicitly says is that, let's just be honest, that this branch of philosophy now known as epistemology is nothing more than the doing away with metaphysics. That's effectively Kant. I mean, this is what Heidegger explicitly says. And he's right, because no one believes in physis anymore, nature. So you can't have a metaphysis if there's no such thing as physis. You can only have theories of knowledge. That's what John Locke grounds all of his arguments about, for instance, politics upon, is his empirical psychology. It's this sense perception approach of, it's kind of like a pointillistic painting. Uh, Everything is these various discrete little atoms, and the mind sees them in terms of patterns and puts them together in terms of patterns. But is there anything really there? Well, according to Locke, no. There's no such thing as even species. No such thing as a genus because you have no species. It's all nominalism for Locke. He's explicit about his nominalism. And it's going to be in response to that empirical psychology that grounds the entirety of their philosophies that Kant, well, begin really with Hume. So beginning with Hume and then Kant and then Hegel, they're all going to be responding to this unfortunate, well, they're going to be responding to the flaws, the fundamental flaws they find in that empirical psychology. And that's going to lead to this question of logic. So that's what's on the table, is really everything. That should sort of blow your hair off, because this seems to be this abstruse discussion of a crisis of science, of logic, and yet it turns out that the very foundations of our understanding of classical liberalism all rest upon this foundation. So pull the rug out of this foundation, everything that grounds modern liberal democracies comes tumbling down. That's how foundational these things are. And that's why you begin to see that the otherwise abstruse texts in philosophy by these great philosophers are getting titled logic. Their very systems of thought are grounded in this new approaches to logic. So that's what's going on here. Um, and let me just be. I'm only going to read the first the introductory part of Husserl's Crisis of the European Sciences, and along the way, I'm going to have to reference um, a few passages from Husserl's earlier writings, the Ideas, uh, or the Logical Investigations. Uh, those are going to be his two other masterpieces, because Husserl is going to explain to us how it is that the crisis of logic is, in fact, a crisis of psychology. And it's going to be this understanding of psychology, because keep in mind, that's what's going on. When you do away with metaphysics and you have the rise of epistemology, keep in mind what you're saying here. Epistemology is a so-called theory of knowing. Well, that's a theory of consciousness. So of course it's psychology, right? That's so in other words, the abandonment of metaphysics that is definitive of postmodern thought, of late modern and postmodern thought, is in fact precisely the rise of psychology as a branch of philosophy. So that's going to be what's going on here. And so, with that being said, let me just read a little bit here. He says, I expect that at this place, dedicated as it is to the sciences, the very title of these lectures, The Crisis of the European Sciences and Psychology, will incite controversy. He says, a crisis of our sciences as such, can we seriously speak of it? Is not this talk, heard so often these days, an exaggeration? After all, the crisis of a science indicates nothing less than that its genuine scientific character, the whole manner in which it has set its task and developed a methodology for it, has become questionable. This may be true of philosophy, which in our time threatens to succumb to skepticism, irrationalism, and mysticism. Uh, he says the same may hold for psychology, insofar as it still makes philosophical claims, rather than merely wanting a place among the positive sciences. Now, let me just add here, positivism. That's going to be key in understanding so much of this philosophical talk of the crisis, because what is happening is you have the rise of what's known as positivism, really coming out of the sort of the French Enlightenment, but it takes on a life of its own, beginning around the early 20th century. Now, it's short-lived, but it was incredibly influential nonetheless. We still have positivists today. Anyone who emphasizes that everything, literally everything, is reducible to scientific explanation, that's a positivist. And scientific explanation in the sense almost always of mathematical reduction, calculability, that kind of thing. Uh, and that's going to have everything to do with what Heidegger is going to refer to as the crisis of technology, the question of technology. Uh, and related to that, the very meaning of what nihilism is. Uh, that's what my whole series on technology and nihilism is about. Between Junger and Heidegger, they're effectively going to argue, and this requires many, many hours of discussion and reading of the text, which I'm doing in the series. But they're going to effectively argue that technology is nihilism. What we understand as technology is nihilism. Uh, in other words, they're the same, just different sides of the same coin, which again should be very fascinating because it turns out that, and this is what I go into great detail in the recording that I'm about to release on Aristotle and Heidegger, to claim that technology is simply applied science, uh, that is so incredibly wrong, and it forces the person who believes that to be a nihilist, whether they know it or not. They are in fact a nihilist. Um, and I go into great detail about that, but let me just sort of continue here. He says, he's talked about, how can it be that there is a crisis of science? We could possibly speak of a crisis of philosophy. We could possibly speak of a crisis of psychology, but how can we speak of a crisis of science? He says, but how could we speak straightforwardly and quite seriously of a crisis of the sciences in general? That is, also of the positive sciences, including pure mathematics and the exact natural sciences, which we can never cease to admire as models of rigorous and highly successful scientific disciplines. Let me add here, the crisis with regard to logic turns out to be a much deeper crisis in an understanding of what mathematics even is. Uh, Again, this is going to be part of entire discussions that I provide, but what it comes down to is that you have to understand the Greeks did not have symbolic representation of numbers. What happens with Descartes is when he discovers or creates, we could say, analytic geometry, what he is doing is he is merging algebra with geometry. And another way to say that is he is merging the discrete with the continuous. The discrete is algebraic, the continuous is geometry. And so now we have mathematical formulations of geometrical shapes. That's effectively what analytic geometry is. Think of the conic sections, etc. In addition to that, you have the Arabic numeral system. That's, in other words, the symbolic representation of numbers by way of these abbreviations that we call our symbols for the numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and even the rise of variables, right? X, Y, Z, etc. None of that existed prior to this. The Greeks knew of the possibility of doing this, but they explicitly did not do that. So the question is why? Why did the Greeks not do that? Well, because it requires, and this gets to the significance of the meaning of abstraction. The Greek word for that is apheresis. In other words, you're taking a particular, in other words, this quantity, a particular of these particular things, and you are representing them in a universal way. Well, can you do that? Can you in fact do that without losing something fundamental to the particular? If I have, two specific seeds or plants, if I abstract them into saying 3p, have I? It seems to be the case that I can do that, right? I can just represent them. However, uh, have I taken something out of there that can't be made universal? And this gets us to the question of nature, physis. All right, see, Zag. Uh, the mathematization of nature is coincident with the flat out rejection of nature, of anything having a physis. For instance, we speak of human nature. Plants have a nature. All particular things have a nature. And what symbolic mathematics does is it eliminates that altogether. So that's going to lead to now this is going to get us into Husserl. Husserl is going to find in that something very problematic. And he traces it back primarily to not simply Descartes, but Galileo. Galileo is the one who famously says the book of nature is written in mathematics. So that's the kind of stuff that's going on in the background here. And so this question of us believing that modern mathematical physics is the standard for truth, for things to be true simply, overlooks entirely the philosophical question of whether or not we can in fact employ mathematics to physical phenomena without losing something that's incredibly determinative of the phenomena itself. And Husserl is going to be the one to really bring this to light. And this, by the way, is why some of you might be familiar with Thomas Kuhn and his very influential book around the 1950s of Scientific Revolutions. This is where we get the phrase paradigm shift. Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts. Kuhn's analysis of the philosophy of science is fundamentally flawed because Kuhn does not take into consideration the revolution in mathematics. That's what's going to ultimately undercut the entirety of Kuhn's claims, which are still very popular today, because it's just so complicated when you start talking about uh, what exactly is going on with abstraction, the process of abstraction by way of symbolic mathematics. Most people don't really know much about it. It involves an enormous amount of study of logic and such. Uh, Now, Kuhn himself was a physicist, so I guess we can't fault him for that. I mean, it is insightful and everything, but it's just important to keep in mind because so many people today, everyone uses that phrase paradigm shift. Well, it turns out that he didn't account for the revolution in math itself. So that means we have to place a little question mark over paradigm shift altogether and say something like, I'll get back to you later, or something like that. But okay, just sort of continuing. He says, to be sure, they, in other words, the rigorous mathematical scientific disciplines, they have proved to be changeable in the total style of their systematic theory building and methodology. He says, only recently they overcame, in this respect, a threatening paralysis under the title of classical physics. Now, he's referring to the transition from classical physics to what is referred to as modern physics. Modern physics should be understood as everything, including and after Einstein. Uh, Holistic, you can have all kinds of fun with that. Uh, Einstein shows us that, well, he probably stole it from someone, but but Einstein is the one who's recorded as being the person who showed us that classical physics, which is to say the billiard ball approach, mechanistic physics, of action and forces and things like that, linear dynamics, that was not the end of the discussion. It turns out that things are relative, and in particular, the most fundamental concepts of all physics, which is space and time, are relative to each other. You have to take those things into consideration, and that gets back around to the rise of non-Euclidean geometries. Uh, Gauss famously said that he didn't. So, one of Gauss's students, Lobachevsky, wrote to him and said, I think I've discovered this amazing breakthrough. And he was talking all about spherical and hyperbolic geometry, in other words, non Euclidean geometries. He says, I think that there's geometries besides Euclidean. And Gauss just sort of casually wrote back from his study. He said, yes, I've already discovered all of this. Yeah, I mean, it's correct. And I think he sent him some of his notes. And Lobachevsky was so disillusioned. He said, why did you not publish any of this? And Gauss famously says, because I didn't want the Bohemians coming after me with torches and pitchforks. In other words, he was saying that he knew that the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry would be a revolution in what everyone had previously understood as the standard of truth, which is to say science itself. And he just didn't want to deal with what he referred to as what we could think of as the hoi polloi, the mobs. He didn't want to deal with them coming after him. But he also said famously, it doesn't matter. Non-Euclidean geometries have no application. Einstein, or allegedly Einstein, is the one who's going to come along and say, you know what, I think I can use hyperbolic geometry, in other words, a particular kind of non-Euclidean geometry, to explain cosmological phenomenon. And that's where we get his general theory of relativity. There's a difference between you have the special theory of relativity and then the general theory. What the general theory does is it explains uh, a four-dimensional nature of our reality as we understand it of the cosmos. And that's going to heavily involve this new form of mathematics. Uh, the number of ways you can describe it if people are interested. It's manifold theory, or you could call it differential geometry, differential topology. It's very fun stuff. It's quite beautiful, and when you look at it. Um, when you look at even the equations and stuff are quite beautiful. But that's what's going on here. That's what he's talking about. So that's the transition he's talking about. And Husserl is saying that only recently did physics recover from this great threat to its very life, its own crisis of classical physics. He says, threatening, that is, as the supposed classical consumption or consummation of the confirmed style of centuries. He says, but does the victorious struggle against the ideal of classical physics, as well as the continuing conflict over the appropriate and genuine form of construction for pure mathematics, mean that previous physics and mathematics were not yet scientific, or that they did not even, though affected with certain unclarities or blind spots, obtain convincing insights within their own field of endeavor? He says, are these insights not compelling, even for us who are freed from such blind spots? He said, can we not thus, placing ourselves back into the attitude of the classical theorists, understand completely how to give rise to all the great and forever valid discoveries, together with the array of technical inventions which so deserve the admiration of earlier generations? He says, physics, whether represented by a Newton or a Planck or an Einstein or whomever in the future, was always and remains exact science. It remains such, even if, as some think, an absolutely final form of total theory construction is never to be expected or even striven for. It says the situation is clearly similar in regards to other large groups of sciences customarily counted among the positivistic sciences. He says, namely the concrete humanistic sciences, however it may stand with their controversial reference back to the ideal of exactness in the natural sciences. A difficulty, incidentally, which concerns even the relation of biophysical or concrete natural scientific disciplines to those of the mathematically exact natural sciences. So let me unpack what he's saying there. He's saying that it could very well be the case that what we understand as the exact mathematical sciences are related in a very fundamental way, which is to say, not an insignificant way, to biology. Now, ultimately, what he's going to come to is this issue of psychology. Um, he says the scientific rigor of all these disciplines, the convincingness of their theoretical accomplishments, and their enduringly compelling success are unquestionable. He says only of psychology must we perhaps be less sure, in spite of its claim to be the abstract, ultimately explanatory, basic science of the concrete humanistic disciplines. All right, that's what needs to be explained. Most people are not familiar with the fact that, and this is, again, this is 1934. What Husserl is saying is that psychology is, in fact, understood as the most basic foundation for all of the sciences. Well, how can that be? Well, remember what I said. Locke and all of the early moderns, beginning with Hobbes, etc., all of them ground their theory of knowledge or epistemology on this, what we could call radical empiricism or empiricist psychology, which is to say that uh, light, well, everything is just particles, these sense data in our eyes and our ears and etc. We just take in this sense data somehow, and it's the work of the human mind to construct that data back into things that we in fact can understand. Now Hobbes, of course, and Locke, they're both nominalists. So what they argue is that despite the fact that the mind collects all this sense data into what appear to be patterns that don't really change, those patterns are not real. That's what I meant when I said there's no such thing as species for these thinkers. They're nominalists. That's problematic. But the point there, though, is that everything is grounded upon that theory of knowledge. And ultimately, what this means uh, is that the early moderns, that's how they do away with Aristotle. It's Aristotle's De Anima that connects the mind with all the all the phenomena of the world. That's no longer possible in modernity, because remember, they want to do away with Aristotle primarily because they want to do away with Christianity. They want to do away with the teachings of the church. And the church, of course, was Thomistic, and Thomas was, of course, Aristotelian. So how do you do away with Thomas without inviting the censure of all the theologians? Well, you just attack Aristotle. And that's what they did. Hobbes famously calls it Aristotelty, or Aristotelianism. And just he mocks the hell out of it. You can't read Hobbes without laughing. It's funny the way he does this. But that's how they get rid of Christianity altogether. They never provide an argument. There's no Enlightenment argument that Christianity or divine revelation is false. There's no argument. Never has been. They just make fun of it. They mock it out of the room. This is what Lessing famously says. He says that the Enlightenment thinkers, uh, they never argued against religion. They just laughed it away. And that, by the way, is why comedy is so powerful. It's far more powerful than tragedy. Uh, in other words, if you can make people laugh, it's far more contagious than raging into the void. That's why, for instance, we no longer have late night comedians. That's why the shit libs outlawed comedy. They did away with it. The late night comedians are not funny, uh, and the reason they're not funny is because all it takes is one good comedian. You can bring down the entire regime. Why do you think everyone hates Donald Trump? Trump is effectively a stand-up comedian. I mean, he's saying things that are hilarious. Nancy Pelosi got schlonged, and then he has to retweet something by saying, "Yeah, I didn't know schlonged had a different meaning like that. Sorry." Right? I mean, that's hilarious, and that's also why the elite hate him, because they think he's so vulgar or something like that. But that's why, again, you can understand the phenomena of Trump in the same way that you can understand. I think his name was David Mackey, the guy that was arrested for doing memes that were effective on Twitter. He was simply too powerful, and they just had to get rid of him. Everything about even his trial and his arrest, it was all a fraud. Uh, that's I see my dear friend Fraser's in here. Fraser's great at this. Fraser's easily one of our best at the memes. And he knows just how powerful these are. That's why the edits and the memes can go so viral. You never really see anything going viral where it's someone just raging against someone else, because no one likes that. Women hate it, and of course, we live under a gynocracy. So if women hate it, it's never going to go viral. But that's the issue. There is that if you can make other people look laughable, you have won. Nothing beats that. And that's what's going on with effectively the Enlightenment. Uh, and that epistemology that they employ. They don't really prove it. They never employ that epistemology. They just say, and because they have to say. I don't even know if Locke or any of them even believe their epistemologies. They're just guessing. They're just like, well, we've done away with Aristotle's De Anima, which was what grounded the entirety of the Western tradition all the way up to 1700. So we got to replace it with something. We can't just leave it empty. And Descartes plays a strong role in this, because that's what the whole method of universal doubt is. In other words, sever the mind from the world, sever the mind from the body, and say that you're a radical skeptic, right? That you're living in we could say you're living in what is it that they say? It's a simulation theory or something like that. Well, whatever. I mean, you're just guessing. There's nothing to prove. You say you're living in a sim. Descartes was the first living in a simulation guy. He was the first, And the history of philosophy ever since then has been trying to put back together what he tore apart. And in Aristotle, it was simply a given that mind and body were a unity. Mind and the rest of the phenomenal world around us was a unity. It's just a given. Aristotle even says to try to argue with people who deny that is just stupid. Anyone who denies the most obvious is just it's a waste of your time. Descartes is the one who says, no, I'm going to make it respectable. And he doubts everything, and then he even doubts God. He says that God might be the world as Descartes understands it could very well be the trick of an evil demon, is what he says. Not even a god, an evil demon. And he's stuck in his own mind, and everything he thinks is nothing more than a dream. He's a mind in a vat. So how can he get back? If you've doubted everything as a policy of principle, how can you reconstruct the world? That's why, by the way, Husserl uses this language of construction. He says construction for pure mathematics. That word construction is what defines modernity. Vico, for instance, and I think Hobbes says this as well, we can only know what we construct. We can't know anything in itself. We can only know what we can build, what we can put together. That's the only way that we can know anything with certainty. Well, you're radically limiting what you can possibly know because you're doing away with everything that's by common sense. And so, all the way down to the level of God. That's why Descartes has to make this tongue in cheek argument for the existence of God. He constructs God in a kind of logical way or something like that, and then builds the world around that. That's modernity, is the building up of everything, the construction of everything by way of mathematics, mathematical physics. The crisis that Husserl is talking about is the fact that all that becomes undone once you realize that the psychology used, this empiricist psychology used, doesn't hold. And so just continuing, he says, but generally, we let psychology stand, attributing its obvious retardation of method and accomplishment to a naturally slower development. He says, at any rate, the contrast between the scientific character of this group of science and the unscientific character of philosophy is unmistakable. And he says, thus we concede in advance some justification to the first inner protest against the title of these lectures. In other words, he's saying, I know people are going to protest and say, what are you talking about, a crisis of science? Nothing could be more certain than mathematical physics. And Husserl is saying, well, not really, because you haven't understood the psychology that founds all of that. But I can see where you're coming from. And then I'm trying to figure out how much more I want to read. Yeah, I'll just read just a little bit more and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up because I think I've already, let's see, I'm just about coming up to an hour mark and I want to keep this kind of short. So then continuing the second section of the opening here, what he says, it may, however, be that what motivates or arises from another direction of inquiry, that of the general lament about the crisis of our culture and the role here ascribed to the sciences. He says, for subjecting the scientific character of all sciences to a serious and quite necessary critique without sacrificing their primary sense of scientific discipline, so impeccable within the legitimacy of their methodic accomplishments. He says, the indicated change in the whole direction of inquiry is what we wish, in fact, to undertake. He says, in doing this, we shall soon become aware that the difficulty which has plagued psychology, not just in our time, but for centuries, its own peculiar crisis, has a certain significance, both for the appearance of puzzling and soluble obscurities in modern, even mathematical sciences, and, in connection with that, for the emergence of a set of world enigmas which were unknown to earlier times. He says they all lead back to the enigma of subjectivity and are thus inseparably bound to the enigma of psychological subject matter and method. He says this much then as a first indication of the deeper meaning of our problem in these lectures. Okay, let me unpack that. Most people do not realize that what we refer to as objectivity, that really just arises with Kant. It's very new under the sun. To claim that something is objectively true, uh, we get that from Kant, because the object, uh, Gegenstand is the German there, uh, that functions in a way that's very similar. It's really identical to the role of a variable in mathematics. When you speak of an object in general, uh, Gegenstand Überall, that's the German there. That's the real significance of Kant's critique of pure reason. He introduces the notion, the concept of an object in general. Notice what is happening there. You are claiming that any particular can be symbolically represented by a universal. That universal is this name, object in general, right? So it's nothing different than a variable in mathematics. But remember what I said, the crisis of mathematics occurs because when you abstract uh, from a particular to a universal by way of a variable, you might lose something in the very nature of it. Kant at least recognizes that. That's why he's going to ultimately come to the conclusion that we cannot know things in themselves. The fact that you can't know a thing in itself stems really from his introduction of an object in general, because he has abstracted, uh, radically abstracted from any particular, whatever universal can be spoken of. But there's a real question as to whether or not you can speak of any universal that can be uh, applied to every particular, right? This is going to unfold in Heidegger to the question of being. Uh, he's going to famously say that the being of being is not itself a being, right? So, what constitutes a thing is itself not a thing. It's some quality of being that is at work, but it can't be spoken of as itself a thing, a being. So in other words, being with a capital B, right? What we think of as ontology or metaphysics in the grand style is not the study of particular objects, but what is it that grounds uh, the very existence, the being of all things. Um, that's what Heidegger's trying to get at. That's what Husserl is moving in the direction of getting at. Uh, that's what they're trying to correct what has been lost with Kant. Uh, so keep in mind, Kant famously concludes that we have literally no access to things in themselves. We're fundamentally cut off. So in other words, Kant manages to perfect Descartes' separation of mind and body. We can never get back to body. All we can know is what's in the mind. We can't even know our own selves. To have self knowledge is impossible with Kant, because the one fundamental thing in itself that's most important is the self, our self. But we're cut off from that. We can't know things in themselves. That includes ourselves. Uh, Husserl is going to famously say, to the things themselves. It's in the introduction to this, the second. It's the second introduction to his famous masterpiece. I believe it's the Logical Investigations. It might be the Ideas. I get them mixed up sometimes, but that's going to be the claim. So we're trying to correct Kant by finding our way back to knowledge that can account in some way for the being of things, for things in themselves. For Husserl, what that means is that's phenomenology. So that's why all of his texts are subtitled Introduction to Phenomenology. This thing known as phenomenology is a way of doing philosophy, a new way of doing philosophy that can hopefully get us back to the things in themselves, to get us back to what Kant said we could not know. In other words, to solve the famous Cartesian paradox of mind and body. Um, that's what's going on here. And so all of that comes tumbling out of this discussion of objectivity. What Husserl is saying is that objectivity, to invoke the claim of objectivity also invokes, because it comes from Kant, it also invokes Kant's conclusion. We can't know things in themselves. So just think about that and how contradictory it is when people say it's objectively true. Well, wait a minute. Uh, Objectivity for Kant means that you can't know things in themselves. So to say that something is objectively true, at least according to Kant and the tradition following, is a paradox. Kant never says that, by the way. What he says is it has apodictic certainty. And apodictic is a transliteration of a Greek word that means unquestionable, no contradictions. So, better way to say what most people mean when they say objective truth is apodictic certainty. Every now and then you'll hear blathermouths use that phrase. I think it's dumb. So expect to hear it from someone like a Jordan Peterson or something like that. They like those fancy words. That's all they're saying. But of course, Peterson doesn't even know where any of this comes from. He wouldn't know anything about that. He would just be using it to try to impress people. So it's what he's saying is that there's the enigma of subjectivity. In other words, the subjectivity is a problem. It has not been solved by the grand claims of objectivity with Kant and the positivists. So Husserl is going to radically reinvoke subjectivity to find a way back to solving this problem. That's what phenomenology is. That's what it means to return to the things themselves. In other words, return to a really kind of a commonsensical approach to things in their particularity and their subjectivity. In other words, their particularity. So don't immediately make this leap to universals. And he says, we make our beginning with a change which set in at the turn of the past century in the general evaluation of the sciences. He says it concerns not the scientific character of the sciences, but rather what they, or what science in general, had meant and could mean for human existence. Okay, now you're about to see fireworks. He says the crisis of the sciences stems from what used to be the fact that the sciences had something of significance or meaning for human existence. And he's about to tell us why that's so important. He says, the exclusiveness with which the total worldview of modern man in the second half of the 19th century let itself be determined by the positive sciences and be blinded by the prosperity. Now, he puts prosperity in quotation marks and uses the English, even in the original German. So he's pointing out that is the English-speaking world that speaks of prosperity or progress. So he's talking about the prosperity they produced. So let me reread that because it's such an important sentence for all of this. He says, the exclusiveness with which the total worldview of modern man in the second half of the 19th century let itself be determined by the positive sciences and be blinded by the prosperity they produced meant an indifferent turning away from the questions which are decisive for a genuine humanity. Now, let me unpack that further. What Husserl is saying is that what we understand as the scientific revolution, the modern scientific revolution, and Descartes and everyone is absolutely explicit about this. The purpose of science is to make man at home in the world, to make man master and possessor of nature. That's what's at stake with this thing we call technology or applied science. It is in the service of man for his prosperity here on earth. And what Husserl is saying is that that prosperity is so overwhelming that it has caused us to slip into an oblivion regarding what is more proper to human existence itself. So we can be lulled away. In other words, think of it this way. Our elites or our technocratic bureaucracy or whatever can make living in the pods so comfortable that we won't even question anymore what it's like to live outside of the pods. This is Nietzsche's last man. They don't even know they invented happiness. I mean, look at all the like the ocular like things that people put over their face to like game and stuff like that. They're selling them now where you can like wear them while you're walking around the house. I mean, God help us with what they're probably doing for porn with all that. But that's what's going on. That's what he's saying there is that the prosperity of Western civilization, due to the applied science or the technology of modern science, has been so overwhelmingly successful that it has caused man to no longer even think about what is more proper to his humanity, to the meaning, the significance. The German there is the Bestimmung of his existence, the significance, the meaning. And what he says is he's continuing. He says, merely fact-minded sciences make merely fact-minded people. Think of that little guy at Daily Wire. Facts don't care about your feelings, right? Uh, that that slogan right there, facts don't care about your feelings, according to Husserl and Nietzsche and Heidegger, that is the motto of the last man. Because look what he's saying. In other words, that is the man who marches under the banner of merely fact-minded sciences, right? They just make fact-minded people. What happens if you expand your understanding of science so that it does account for the human being? Because to say that, for instance, well, as he says it, fact-minded sciences make fact-minded people. What he's saying is that that makes people who understand humans as nothing more than hairy bags of water, hairy bags of mostly water. That's all we are. It's the radical positivist reduction of human being to mere materials. And he says, continuing, he says, the change in public evaluation was unavoidable. He says, especially after the war. He's talking about the First World War. He says, and we know that it has gradually become a feeling of hostility among the younger generation. Now, this is crucial. He's broached the fact that this spans and has consequences on the youth. And as I like to always remind people, if you lose the youth, you've lost everything, because we as a generation will only live for a generation. But you get a few generations that grow up under this tyranny of, as he says, fact-minded sciences. You're going to get nothing more than mere fact-minded people. They're not going to know anything about true human existence. Uh, I would add, by the way, this is what happens in various understandings of Christianity, because uh, this fact-mindedness stuff is exactly what constitutes higher biblical criticism. In other words, treat the Bible as a book that needs to be uh, that needs to live up to the standards of modern science. And if it doesn't live up to it, well, then it's no longer really reliable, right? If it's just a book of myths, and it's not even a coherent book of myths because there's all kinds of various authors, even within the various books, then why should anyone believe what the Bible says? Why, okay, so they tried to preserve Christianity while no longer thinking that the Bible itself is divine revelation. But it only takes a few generations of that. And next thing you know, you have people no longer even wanting to retain their Christian belief. It's like, well, I just don't even need it at all anymore, right? I mean, it's all just myths and facts and history all the way down. Uh, that's another way to see it. And in fact, that's another series I'm doing on the reception of German philosophy in America, because that's what speaks to how it is that our institutions were overtaken by the left. It's much, much older than just saying blame it on Hegel. Uh, he says, in our vital need, now this is crucial because in my orbit, at least, people are always talking about vitalism. Uh, they understand that our world, our culture has been sapped of any kind of sense of life. It's just a bunch of bug men, right? Uh, it's just a bunch of effeminate men who want to say, no, 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 don't name call, don't lose your temper, be civil, right? Let everyone call you Nazis, but don't ever, act, don't do unto them as they do unto you. Uh, that's why there's this powerful undertow among many people of wanting to say, to hell with all of you. I'm going to show you what real life is. We're going to, and that's why you have the so-called return movements. whether it's return to Greece or whether it's return to Renaissance, or whether it's return to a kind of prehistorical thing or something like that. That's what it all comes down to, is that this world we have right now lacks vitality. In other words, it needs Viagra. It's impotent. Our culture is impotent, and the youth see it most especially. The older people do not see it because they can't imagine that the world they themselves were complicit in making uh, didn't live up to what they thought it would be. So they just think that everything is just a flash in the pan. It's like, this will pass. These unruly kids, they're a bunch of reactionaries. They're a bunch of racist, xenophobe Nazis. We'll just find a way to pass laws to just flat out imprison them. We'll turn America into what's happening in the UK. That's their approach to things, because they don't want to come to terms with the fact that the world they created has such fundamental flaws that it no longer satisfies their own youth, their own children. They just can't face it. They simply can't accept it. Uh, it's hilarious, really, to witness it happening. That they will flat out deny the truth of their own labor. But what he says is, he says, in our vital need, so we are told, this science, in other words, the positive sciences, has nothing to say to us. It excludes, in principle, precisely the questions which man, given over in our unhappy times to the most portentous upheavals, finds the most burning. Questions of the meaning or the meaninglessness of the whole of human existence. And there you really have it. I'm not even 3 pages into the text. Husserl has diagnosed everything that's going on in our world right now. Uh, you see that what happens in the early 20th century with the wars is that, well, Spengler says it best with the title of his book, The Decline of the West. It was a palpable recognition that Western civilization was on a radical decline. America finally enters the war and ends it by dropping nukes. And then there is a incredible rebound of economic flourishing, because remember that it's the war that gets America out of the depression more than anything else. It's not the policies of FDR, all of that stuff. I mean, that, if anything, FDR's policies contributed to keeping us in the depression longer. What got America out of the war was the industrial military complex. The fact that they needed to be making all these things. It put people to work, and all of the countries around the world wanted what we were producing, and that's what saved us. That is the mentality of the so-called neocons. That's where all of this comes from. They saw a way out of what they thought there was the decline of the world, and they were riding in on the tidal wave of flourishing that occurred after the war, after America ended it and was incredibly economically prosperous. That's when they began to tinker further with really the American government. I mean, this is LBJ's Great Society, the high tide of liberalism. They're the ones tinkering around with all that. That's why they can't come to terms with the fact that they failed. Look at our world. We have trannies jingling their ball bags in front of little children. And people just shrug their shoulders at this point and say, well, I mean, what am I going to do about it? And then the neocons, for the most part, when they're not flat out endorsing this shit, uh, all of the so-called Republicans right now in Congress, they don't care to see an end to any of this. I mean, hell, most of them are degenerates themselves. Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, who knows what the hell they do behind closed doors. I mean, I have a pretty good idea, but they don't care to change any of that because they're part of it. But they made this world. They created all this, and so they just sort of close their mind to it and say, "Well, it can't last, right? It can't last." Like we. This is them thinking. We created such a wonderful America that if people could just go back to Reagan, it's all Reagan. It's Reagan is our great savior. We can be saved if we go back to Reagan. Yeah, okay, sure. What does Reagan have to teach us about grown men tucking their balls between their legs and hopping around in front of little kids as if their ball bag was a bunny tail? Uh, Not sure that's going to work anymore. We've passed a new era, a new demarcation, um, and our own Republicans don't really seem to care about ending it. So this return to Reagan they speak of is just even tongue in cheek. Even that return to Reagan, it's just a joke. And Husserl has put his finger on all of it. Uh, he said that it was the economic prosperity in conjunction with this materialistic science, and we must include economics in there, uh, that has caused people to believe that science has nothing to offer uh, human existence. In other words, except insofar as it can provide us material wealth, except insofar as it can provide comfortable life for hairy conscious bags of water. That's all it is. And so this is going to be what Husserl does. He's going to reground philosophy in this new thing that he calls phenomenology, wherein science is going to be radically understood as no longer objective, but subjective. In other words, the belief that any causal events happened outside of the mind without any interference of the mind, that's what's that's what has to be done away with. Husserl is going to bring into the equation of causal events the role of consciousness. So that's what this this whole talk of psychology comes back around in Husserl to really a correction of the radical empiricism that grounded modern liberalism, which is to say modern science, which is the thing which promised us all these great things from this experimental project known as liberal democracy. And so that's what all of this is getting back to. So Husserl is so all of the talk of consciousness you hear about in philosophy. This is where it comes from. Uh, it's a kind of rebranding of what really Hegel had kind of kicked off with the role of consciousness and the phenomenology of spirit or Geist, because Hegel is trying to solve Kant's problem of the separation of mind from things in themselves by showing that things are always related by way of this Hegelian dialectic, uh, which itself is just another attempt to solve the Cartesian paradox of the mind body separation, which itself was to get away from uh, the account of soul in Aristotle's De Anima. Uh, so that's the long kind of way in which you can understand this. And so it's going to be Husserl who's going to bring all of this back onto the forefront of discussion. And then Heidegger is going to further explore all of this. Because remember, Husserl was Heidegger's teacher. And Heidegger is going to require, he flatly says, anyone who wants to understand being and time, they only have to make sure that they read one book. And it's Husserl's logical investigations. So that's how logic, psychology, philosophy, and so they all come into play with the grounding that's needed to correct what's understood as a crisis of all the sciences. And interestingly enough, I can't emphasize this enough. Mathematics is at the core of all this because Husserl is the one who initiates the return to the Greeks. Nietzsche had already done it. Husserl has read Nietzsche, but Husserl returns to the Greeks not as a kind of return movement, but more as a attempt to use the concepts that he finds in Plato and Aristotle pertaining to mind and see how they can help us in modern science today. And so that's what's happening. And it's from there that Heidegger is going to have a lot of critique, but also a lot of praise for Husserl. But all of that speaks to the so-called crisis of reason, the fact that human mind or reason can no longer even answer in any significant way the question of what is the good life and how do I live it? Husserl is going to provide a way out by founding this new kind of philosophy known as phenomenology. Um, and that's really what ultimately becomes. People might have heard the distinction. You have so-called analytic philosophy, and then you have continental philosophy. Continental philosophy is really all of this that's come tumbling out uh, from Husserl, whereas analytic philosophy is going to be more of the positivist approach in the sense of emphasizing things like uh, science as it was traditionally understood, which is to say, in the Kantian sense, Kant flatly says, nature, I only understand by nature or as nature anything that can be represented mathematically. Um, and so that's ends up morphing into these approaches to even grammar. That's why you have the deconstructionist, the radical emphasis upon words, grammar, language. That's Wittgenstein. But that's the analytic schools versus the continental schools, which are going to thoroughly be founded or grounded in this belief that you can't have that kind of objectivity because the role of the subject himself, us, our consciousness, in the event is fundamental to our understanding of the event. And in fact, to the causality of the event itself. Uh, and that's where the two things, the two roads depart radically. Uh, I like to think that analytic philosophy has basically died out, but you still have a number of people that are living on in the analytic tradition. Um, I simply take it as a given that the continental approach to philosophy is the correct approach because they're the ones who bring back the Greeks uh, because the tradition of philosophy had been so thoroughly distorted. Uh, now, when I say this, I have to be careful. I'm not saying this as a critique, but the tradition of Greek and Roman philosophy was fundamentally distorted by the medieval Christian scholastics. And by the way, not just the Christian scholastics, but also the Islamic and the Judaic medievals. They distorted it as well uh, because you have to understand, they were deliberately appropriating Greek and Roman philosophy into their theology. So that's how it was that philosophy becomes the handmaid of theology. What you have with Nietzsche, Husserl, all of these guys is they're saying, no, philosophy is not the handmaid. Let's see what philosophy can do on its own, unfreed from the tradition of interpretation that has become authoritative in various institutions by way of the Christian scholastics, and in particular Thomas Aquinas. That's what they're getting away from. They're saying let's return to these guys and see what their thought was in its own right, not what Thomas made of them or any of the neo-Thomistic schools. Heidegger goes into enormous detail about this, and I'll be including that in the series because it's so fundamental. In fact, Heidegger now, and this is again to emphasize that this is not a critique of the medieval Christians or the scholastics. Heidegger flatly says, and I mean, I could read it, it's literally what he says. If you do not understand the concept of being in, for instance, Thomas and let's see, Duns Scotus, then you do not understand anything about modern philosophy. Heidegger is emphatic about that. You cannot understand modernity unless you understand the medieval Christian scholastics. They're that important for Heidegger. So again, not to say that we can throw them out. Heidegger never argues that you throw. When Heidegger speaks of the destruction of the Western philosophic tradition, he absolutely does not mean that you are free to just simply burn their books and forget about them. Heidegger spends his own life teaching these things. He spends entire years teaching Scotus, Thomas, Occam, Luther. He has enormous amount to say about Luther. And all of this in the context of the argument that let's let philosophy shine forth on its own outside of what these authors have done to philosophy by way of theology. So that's and it's really even further because I always have to emphasize this because there's so much of I hear these debates happening all the time on Twitter of Catholics versus Protestants. It was not the Protestants who did the attack upon the Catholics. It was the humanists, uh, and in many cases, humanist Catholics who were attacking the church. It was not Luther. Luther didn't start it at all. If anything, Erasmus is the one who started it, and Erasmus was always a Catholic. So that's why I emphasize that anyone who's taken like history, even undergrad history majors, the course is called Renaissance Reformation, and they refer to it as Ren Ref. In other words, Renaissance first, then the Reformation. Well, what was the Renaissance? Well, that was the humanists who were very, very rabidly attacking the claims of the church, uh, the claim that they were infallible with regard to understanding scripture, biblical scripture. Because what were the humanists doing? Well, they were relearning Petrarch, Dante. They were all relearning uh, Greek. They were relearning Latin, which is to say, they were learning how to read the Bible on their own. And when Erasmus read the Septuagint in the Greek, he found over 1,100 problems with the church's interpretation of various passages of Scripture. So again, this was not, it's not a Protestant versus Catholic thing. To frame it that way is to be so fundamentally mistaken on the history that it's almost not even worth addressing, but you have to, because so many of these discussions I hear and the attacks from both sides, really, I mean, I'm not siding with anyone on this, but the attacks on both sides speak as if there were no such thing as the Renaissance. Like the Renaissance itself must not have existed because they have no reference to the humanists. They just want to flatly jump and make it a war between Catholics and Protestants. It's not at all what happened. And Heidegger brings that out again, and Husserl understands this. All of our deeper thinkers understand this. It's when philosophy gets disseminated into the city among the common people that the important details get lost. Um, but anyway, okay. So I started this at 5:45. It's so that's an hour and a half. All right, I'll end it there. Uh, Again, this was just an impromptu space because I'm about to release the recording for Aristotle and Heidegger on technology. And I'm very excited about this because uh, anyone who is interested in the depths of Aristotle's thought, which is to say his physics, his metaphysics, all of that, I'm taking you into the text. I'm going line by line and word by word. Uh, so if you've ever wanted to understand Aristotle, but have no idea when you've looked in his text, like I can't even understand the first sentence. What does this even mean? I'm taking you there. And I'm going to very, very carefully and meticulously walk you into uh, what I would suggest is a better introduction. You'll walk away from the recording I'm doing on Aristotle and Heidegger with a better knowledge of Aristotle, regardless if you have no background whatsoever. You will have a better understanding of Aristotle than 99% of undergraduate philosophy majors. Uh, that's how well I've put this thing together to lead you into the depths. And also, you're going to find out just how wrong almost everyone is in casually speaking about Aristotle's understanding of metaphysics or being and these kinds of things. I present it in a way that I solve all of that garbage that gets bandied about in these discussions that often you hear on Twitter or whatnot. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. And I've got a number of other long format recordings on the way as well. Some with Kant, some with the rise of so-called higher biblical criticism. In other words, how is it that Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, have become so corrupt. Well, I'm going to take you into the primary source documents where it happens. So it's not going to. So you won't be reading like the history of Catholic theology, in the modern world, or the history of Protestant. No, 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 my friend. I am taking you directly to what Augustine says. I'm taking you directly to what Luther says. I'm taking you directly into Thomas. I'm taking you into Duns Scotus. I'm taking you into William of Ockham. I'm taking you into all of their texts in an introductory way. I don't presuppose that you have any knowledge of these things already. And I'm making them where you will at least walk away with not only the knowledge of where they get said in the texts, but also what is actually said. And further, what does it even mean when they say it? So, for instance, just the first thing that comes to mind, uh, there's no such thing as Occam's razor. Occam never calls it a razor. He calls it his principle of parsimony. Uh, and just think about the significance of that word, the principle of parsimony. That takes away the kind of bluntness or the pejorative connotation that the razor, with its sharp edge, would otherwise invite into the discussion. So in any case, I'm just really excited about all this. And now that I've finished my move, I've set my library up. I'm ensconced into complete isolation in the mountains, and I'm ready to just pour forth all kinds of I guess, content or whatever people want to call it. But I'm excited about it. So okay, so keep an eye out for that. I hope everyone has had a wonderful weekend. And for those of you who stay up late in spaces, raging against other people, fighting, shame on you. Shame on you. I'm joking, of course, because that's me. In any case, I hope everyone's had a wonderful weekend, and hopefully I'll see you all soon again in spaces. Thank you all so much for listening to me sort of scatterbrain talk about my thoughts and stuff. But I'm just excited because I think this is something that's so good for a number of people, and no one else seems to be doing it. Twitter is, or X, whatever you want to call it, it is whatever you make it. And so why would you not want to share whatever your expertise or your knowledge is, right? Because you get the chance to speak to the world. I mean, this is completely new in human history. This is a digital revolution that's not existed before. And so, you've got the chance. In any case, all right, I'll call it a night right there. So talk to you all soon.